23rd edition of the International Symposium on Physics. We ask all participants to keep the microphone off during the entire session to avoid interruptions. For our Zoom audience, in case of any inconvenience that may arise during the session, we ask that you send a direct message to the staff who have the name Implexis staff in this session. If you would like to ask Dr. Heeger a question, please send it as a direct message to Implexis Q&A. For those of you who are attending in person at the Congress Center, you can send your questions to him through our staff. Today, we are joined by Karsten Heeger. He is a professor of physics, chair of the physics department, and director of the Wright Laboratory at Yale University. His research focuses on the study of the neutrino oscillations and neutrino mass. Professor Heeger received his undergraduate degree in physics from Oxford University and his PhD from the University of Washington in Seattle, where he worked on a model-independent measurement of the solar 8B neutrino flux in the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory. Before joining the faculty at Yale University, he was on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin and Chamberlain Fellow at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. His work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the 2016 Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics. He is a fellow of the American Physical Society. At Yale, Professor Heeger has led the renovations and transformation of the Wright Nuclear Structure Laboratory into the new Yale Wright Lab, with a vibrant research program in nuclear, particle, and astrophysics, and is co-chairing the planning for the new Physical Sciences and Engineering Building and Advanced Instrumentation Center at Yale. Welcome, Dr. Heeger.
Well, thank you for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I'm delighted to talk about my work, and in particular the research I've done on neutrinos in recent years. So let me share my screen. Oops. I hope you can see this. In this talk, I'll be talking about new physics that we can learn from studying one of the most mysterious particles that we have in the universe, neutrinos, and in particular, the study of neutrinos from nuclear reactors. And I'll give you a little bit of a historic overview, as well as some of the recent results of what we have learned. This talk will be about an hour. And then after that, I'd be happy to answer questions and engage in any discussions. Neutrinos are amongst the most mysterious particles of the universe. They fill space, they stream through the universe at the speed of light, and they give us a glimpse. They are a window to the invisible part of the universe, which we usually can't see when we look out into the sky. This is an image taken with the Hubble telescope. You see galaxies, you see stars, you see all sorts of structures, but there's much more to the universe, the invisible universe, which we cannot see. And some of it is made up of neutrinos. You might wonder why we care about neutrinos. Neutrinos, turns out, are amongst the most abundant particles in the universe besides photons. So if you count the number of particles you have in the universe and you look at them per cubic centimeter, for example, you see that the photons are the most abundant particles, followed just by neutrinos. All the stuff that we see around us, the matter, protons, neutrons, electrons, there are several orders of magnitudes less abundant in the universe. And so we really want to understand the role of neutrinos and the role that neutrinos have played in the evolution of the universe and their properties. Just to leave you with a couple of numbers, if you look at a cubic centimeter in space in the universe, which is about the size of a sugar cube, you find about 330 neutrinos on average. Of course, those neutrinos are not standing still. They are zipping through the universe, essentially at the speed of light. But on average, you always have about 300 neutrinos in a cubic centimeter. And that's about 1 billion times more than the number of protons that we find in the universe. And so knowing these numbers, you can ask yourself, what role do neutrinos play? Why do they matter? And why are they important for us to understand? Before we get into the properties of neutrinos, I also wanted to tell you a little bit about what the universe is made of. The universe is filled with a variety of matter. And if we make a pie chart of the energy density of the matter in the universe, we find that the matter that we know about, the heavy elements, is one of the smallest parts. It's about 0.03%. Neutrinos make up about 0.3% of the universe. And that's almost as much as all the stars that we see on the night sky, which are about 0.5%. A lot of the matter that we find in the universe is hydrogen and helium in clouds distributed through the universe. It's about 4%. And then there's a large chunk in the universe that we don't know anything about, and we label it dark matter and dark energy. Dark energy is a mysterious force that drives the universe apart, and dark matter is something that seems to be affecting how galaxies rotate, how the motion of gravitational objects behave in the universe, but we don't know what it is. But from this pie chart, you can see that neutrinos are as important as all the stars on the night sky. They do have a little mass, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. They're highly abundant, and with that, they play an important role in the universe. It turns out that neutrinos have been with us since the beginning of time. The idea is that the universe started in a Big Bang. We had a soup of particles and antiparticles early on. The universe quickly expanded, and then particles froze out, and structures formed in the universe, first galaxies, and then about 14 billion years later, nowadays, we see the universe with galaxies, large-scale structures, and everything that we can observe in astronomy. And it turns out that neutrinos have been with us since the beginning of time. Neutrinos and antineutrinos were part of the soup of particles that were created early on. And in principle, nowadays, we should still be able to detect the so-called relic neutrinos that are left over from the Big Bang. It is very difficult to see them. They are very low energy, and we have not yet observed them experimentally, but we know that they must be there. And over the last 14 billion years, neutrinos have played a very important role. They stream through the universe essentially at the speed of light. They carry energy, they have little mass, and they act as very efficient energy carriers. And it turns out that the large-scale structures that we see nowadays could not have evolved in the way that we see them now without the influence of neutrinos. So neutrinos, free-streaming neutrinos, are an important ingredient in understanding the structure of the universe. Neutrinos are an elementary particle. They are part of what we call the standard model of physics. And in the standard model, we have families of particles and antiparticles. You've heard about quarks, and we have antiquarks. You've heard about leptons, electrons, muons, and taus. And then associated with that, we have three families of active neutrinos: electron, muon, and tau neutrinos, and the antiparts. And it turns out from accelerator studies that were done a while ago that there have to be three families of leptons and three flavors of active neutrinos. You can look at the decay width of the Z boson, and it turns out if you measure that decay width, it can decay into different types of invisible particles. And from that, you can infer that there have to be three families of neutrinos, three flavors. In the standard model, it was assumed that neutrinos are essentially massless, which we now know is wrong. They do have a little bit of mass. And from some kinematic studies, we could infer some upper limits on the neutrino mass. Now, since the early studies, we've learned much more, and we now know that neutrinos have a little bit of mass. We don't know what it is, but we're trying to understand the mass and other properties of neutrinos because it seems to be an indication for physics beyond the standard model. Neutrinos can be found in a lot of different places around us. And this is a slide that shows you different sources of neutrinos. I mentioned the Big Bang at the beginning of time, and the neutrinos that are left over from the Big Bang are very low in energy, a fraction of an electron volt. We have neutrinos that come from nuclear decays inside the Earth, inside nuclear reactors. We have neutrinos that are produced in the nuclear reactions in the sun. And we also have neutrinos that come from interactions in the atmosphere or are produced by artificial accelerators. All these neutrinos span a wide variety of energies, from a fraction of an electron volt at the Big Bang to GeV type neutrinos or even higher neutrinos in the atmosphere, in accelerators, and extragalactic neutrinos. Now, with a variety of sources like this, you can do a whole lot of different neutrino studies. And people have built experiments to study neutrinos from essentially all of these sources. In this talk, I will focus on neutrinos from nuclear reactors. It turns out they are a very well-suited source of neutrinos. They're well characterized, we understand them well, and it allows us to do some very important studies of neutrinos. Before I get to that, I just wanted to show you a map of all the antineutrinos worldwide. I mentioned that neutrinos are produced in a variety of sources, nuclear decays, and it turns out that the radioactivity in the Earth, in the crust of the Earth, actually produces lots of neutrinos. And this is a map, it's a calculation of all the neutrinos emitted from the crust and mantle of the Earth through nuclear decays. And you see certain hotspots and you see where the Earth is colder in neutrinos. We can also look at a map of neutrinos, or antineutrinos to be specific, from nuclear reactors around the world. And this is what it would look like. And you see, of course, the clustering in certain areas where there's lots of nuclear power, and people have built a number of nuclear reactors and nuclear power stations. And it turns out that the scientific community has used a number of these reactors to mount experiments, to study neutrinos, and to study their properties. So for us scientists, the neutrinos that come out of nuclear reactors are a byproduct and a free and cheap source of neutrinos that we study. This is a map that shows a collection of experiments worldwide that study neutrinos from nuclear reactors. I'm not going to go into the details here, but again, it of course follows the map of nuclear reactors in the world. And you can see that a number of countries are involved in this. And it turns out all of the experiments that I've been involved in have been international scientific collaborations where people come together to work at a particular place to do these experiments. Let's go back a little bit in history. Before we really knew about the neutrino, let's go back to the beginning of the 20th century. It was in 1914 that Chadwick made studies of nuclear decay. And Chadwick found that when you look at the decay of certain nuclei, some of them seem to emit electrons. And that seemed to indicate that there were a two-body process involved. But he measured a continuous spectrum, and that puzzled everyone, because if you only have a daughter nucleus and an electron coming out, it would have been a very sharp energy. So that led people to speculate that maybe there has to be a third particle involved. And it was in 1930 that Wolfgang Pauli made the postulate and said that there has to be a particle, an invisible particle that we cannot see, that we don't know about yet, to explain the energy distribution of this beta decay. At the time, it was a very a bold postulate to just say that there has to be another particle. People hadn't done this before. And of course, since then, people have postulated and suggested a number of particles, and we now know that there are many more elementary particles. Since Pauli in 1930, it took another 25 years before people actually were able to make the first detection, experimental observation of the free antineutrino. And it was Reines and Kahn in 1956. They used antineutrinos from a nuclear reactor. They built a detector with a liquid scintillator that contained lots of protons, and then used the inverse beta decay reaction, where an antineutrino interacts with the proton to produce a positron and a neutron to detect the neutrino. The fact that it took 25 years since Pauli's postulate to do this measurement is an indication how difficult it has been to detect neutrinos. They're very weakly interacting. They go through all the matter, and you have to build special detectors to make measurements. Just as a side, I wanted to mention that the first proposal for the direct detection of a neutrino actually didn't involve a nuclear reactor. People had suggested after World War II to use a nuclear device, a nuclear bomb. This was a proposal from Los Alamos, but then it was decided that this was impractical, and it was much easier to build a detector next to a nuclear reactor than to detonate a bomb and have a detector deep underground. And it was in 1950 that Bruno Pontecorvo pointed out that nuclear reactors might be an ideal source of neutrinos. They are a pure source of electron antineutrinos, so only one flavor comes out, and this allows you to build experiments dedicated to the study of these particles. And in 1953, an experiment got underway. It was called Project Poltergeist, to detect this new particle that had been postulated, talked about, that people had not seen yet, not detected. And Poltergeist is a German name for something that you can't see and that's around and it makes noise. And so it was a very fitting name for an experiment that was trying to detect this invisible new elementary particle. The experiment used a big tank of liquid scintillator with photomultipliers surrounding it. And the idea was, if the neutrinos interacted with the protons in the scintillator, you would be able to detect the light flashes from the positron annihilation and the neutron capture. And it turns out that this technique, this coincidence technique, is still used nowadays for experiments that study neutrinos and try to make precision measurements of antineutrino properties. One of the challenges, however, was reducing the backgrounds and seeing enough of the signal so that you could unambiguously claim that you have observed neutrinos and not just gammas or other backgrounds in your experiment. So this experiment started out, they saw something, but initially they had very high background and it was difficult to make a conclusive statement. And then they upgraded the experiment. Instead of just using one tank with liquid scintillator, they used multiple tanks. So they started to segment the detector, they interlaid it with shielding. And then they read out the photomultipliers, the photosensors from the experiment with scopes. And you can see the traces of the scopes here in this slide. And basically it shows you the initial positron annihilation. It gives you a blip in the trace of the scope, and then the delayed neutron capture. And so the signature of a neutrino in this detector would be a prompt and delayed signal separated by a characteristic time And you would essentially look at two traces on the scope that would give you the initial blip and the second blip. And when you saw that coincidence, you could be sure that you had detected a neutrino. Nowadays, of course, we're not just looking at scopes. We have electronics to do this sort of thing. But at the time, people were actually sitting there and watching it on the scope to count their data and count their events. And I mentioned how difficult it was to detect the signal amongst background. And so people actually piled up shielding around the experiment. And at the time, it was bags of sawdust that was soaked with water. The water acted as neutron shielding. And nowadays, of course, we have more sophisticated ways of doing it, but shielding was important from the beginning up to now. So since then, we've come a long ways. And in the next few slides, I wanted to give you an overview of some of the observations and discoveries we have made, starting from the first observation of the antineutrino in 1956 by Reines and Cowan. We built an experiment that made the first observation of reactor antineutrino disappearance, indicating a new phenomenon called neutrino oscillations. In 2012, we measured one of the neutrino mixing angles in the oscillation with reactor neutrinos. And now we're running experiments to look for new flavors of neutrinos, so-called sterile neutrinos, that might indicate a new form of matter. And all of this was done with reactor neutrinos at different reactors at different baselines from the reactor core. So reactor neutrinos really have become a tool for precision measurements of neutrino properties. We can nowadays measure the spectra of neutrinos coming out of a reactor. So by measuring the energy spectrum, we can infer something about the isotopes in a nuclear reactor. We can study the neutrino properties such as neutrino oscillations. That's a phenomenon when one flavor of neutrino gets produced and it changes through a quantum mechanical oscillation effect into another flavor. We can look for neutrino magnetic moments and other effects of new physics. And we've also, with the techniques and instruments that we have developed, we've been able to now develop detectors that can monitor reactors, that can tell us something about the fuel burn up inside the reactor, about the isotopic composition. And this can be used to monitor actually the state of a reactor and tell you what's the status the fuel is and if there's any isotope diversion, for example, from a reactor. One of the first large experiments to study reactor antineutrinos was the Camelot experiment in Japan. This was built in the late 1990s, so it was 40 years after the initial experiment that was done to observe the antineutrino. And this experiment wanted to measure the reactor antineutrinos from all the nuclear power plants in Japan. What you see here on the slide is a map of Japan, and it shows the distribution of nuclear reactors that existed before the earthquake, before the reactors were shut down. And so we use the neutrino flux out of these nuclear reactors to make a measurement over 180 kilometers average distance of the reactor flux. We built an experiment in the Kamioka mine, and it consisted of a kiloton liquid scintillator detector, which is a big tank filled with liquid scintillator, surrounded by thousands of photomultipliers, but again, detecting antineutrinos through the inverse beta decay reaction, which is an antineutrino interacting with a proton and creating a positron and a neutron. Here are just a couple of pictures of the experiment. On the left, you see the graphic rendering. You see a person on top of it, so it gives you a sense of scale of the experiment. This was built underground in a mine to get away from cosmic rays, to provide shielding that we needed. It was a big cavity that was excavated, and we built a spherical detector in there, filled it with liquid scintillator, and in the end we only had access from the top for calibration sources and so on. With the kiloton of liquid scintillator, we had about 10 to the 31 protons in the detector, and so having neutrinos from the reactors hitting our detector, even if the cross-section is very small, if the interaction is very weak, having so many protons, you can have then a good chance of detecting the neutrinos. And what we measured and found was quite remarkable. On the right-hand side, you see a figure that shows the observed flux number of neutrinos as a function of distance from a reactor. And you see from all the experiments that were done before Camland, it was essentially consistent with the expectation. You can calculate how many neutrinos come out of a reactor, you measure it, and you found the right number. But it turned out that if you go to a large enough distance, there seemed to be fewer neutrinos than expected, fewer than what you would expect from the 1/r squared fall off. And it turned out it was about 60%. And this deficit was due to the fact that neutrinos were actually oscillating. The electron antineutrinos produced in a reactor oscillated into something else through a quantum mechanical effect, and therefore we couldn't see them anymore in our detector. And moreover, we found that when we measured the energy spectrum of reactor neutrinos, shown on the left here, that it showed a distortion. It was not the kind of spectrum that we expected from the dashed line shown here. So the fact that the spectrum was distorted showed us that it had to be an energy-dependent effect. And if we plot the survival probability, meaning how many neutrinos do we expect as a function of distance over energy, we get the plot on the right, which shows this characteristic oscillation that I just referred to. So the measurement of reactor neutrinos at Camland was the first terrestrial demonstration that neutrinos actually oscillate, that neutrinos must have mass, and that there has to be physics beyond the standard model. So it turns out that this measurement that we did with reactor neutrinos was consistent with something that had also been seen with solar neutrinos, neutrinos from the sun, a few years earlier. The Sudbury Neutrino Observatory and other experiments had observed that neutrinos can change flavor when they come from the sun. The sun produces electron neutrinos, and in the SNOW experiment, we had observed that when they arrive on Earth, they are muon or tau neutrinos. So this flavor conversion was also an indication of neutrino oscillation and the fact that neutrinos have mass. And the way it actually turns out to behave is like a sinusoidal wave. So this is an expression here that gives you the so-called survival probability, which depends on the distance the neutrino travels, the energy it has, the mass splitting, the mass difference between the different neutrino states that are involved in this, and a so-called mixing angle, which is essentially the amplitude of the oscillation. And so the fact that neutrinos seem to show this oscillation was an indication that neutrinos are made up of different mass states, and that when they propagate in space, you get this oscillation effect, and they essentially change from one flavor, which is a linear combination of mass states, to another flavor, which is a slightly different linear combination of mass states. And so for these observations, the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded in 2015. Art McDonald was the director of the SNOW Observatory. Kajita led the observation of the neutrino oscillations from the atmosphere, actually. And then the Camland collaboration and other collaborations shared the breakthrough prize in 2016 for the observation of terrestrial neutrino oscillations. And so what this indicated to us was that when we think about three neutrinos, we not only have three flavors, electron, muon, and tau neutrinos, but we have to think of three states. And I really like the analogy of the jelly bean jar that you can see in the picture up there on the slides, that basically shows that a certain flavor consists of three different states, or reversely, if you have a neutrino state, nu1, nu2, nu3, it has the ingredients of the three different flavors. It has a little bit of nu e, a little bit of nu mu, and a little bit of nu tau. And when neutrinos propagate through space, then you have a certain chance of detecting either one flavor or the other flavor. And the way you describe it mathematically is that you write a neutrino mixing matrix. That's a formalism similar to quark mixing. You have mixing angles that describe the amplitude of the mixing. And over the last few years, we've done experiments, reactor, accelerator, atmospheric experiments to measure these different mixing parameters. And these different mixing angles have been measured. And I just wanted to point out one of them, theta 1,3, which is a mixing angle that we measured with reactor neutrinos because it connects to CP violation. By measuring this mixing angle, we could show that CP violation is a possibility in the lepton sector. So I mentioned these mixing matrices and the analogy to the quark sector. Now, one of the curious things is that the mixing matrices seem to look very different in terms of the mixing elements between the quark and the lepton sector. And people don't understand this yet, why. And one of the goals of our research is to understand why are there such differences between leptons and quarks. And we want to understand the structure that underlies this. So before I talk about a couple of other experiments I've done now to measure these neutrino mixing parameters, basically the questions that we're trying to answer now is, how do neutrinos oscillate? We have observed this oscillation effect. We don't know exactly where it comes from. There have to be three neutrino states, but how do they oscillate? What are the parameters? What is the physics behind this? Are there only three neutrinos, or are there perhaps more neutrinos? And if we have three neutrinos with different mass states, what's the ordering of the mass states? You can rearrange the spectrum of neutrinos in different forms, and that might tell you something about the structure of neutrino masses. And then there are other questions that we don't know the answer to. What's the absolute mass of neutrinos? We've measured mass differences very well, but we don't know what the absolute mass is. Neutrinos could also be their own antiparticles. They have no charge, and in principle, they could be their own antiparticles. And we are doing experiments right now to test this. This would be an indication that neutrinos are so-called Majorana particles. And then we expect that there is CP violation, but it has not been measured yet. And this is also one of the goals in neutrino physics. So there's a whole suite of questions, and the physics and the future of neutrino physics is really quite rich. So I'll just focus on the first three questions and give you an indication of what we have done to understand in a little bit more detail neutrino oscillations. So I mentioned that neutrinos, antineutrinos from reactors, are a very good toolbox to study neutrinos. Reactors produce electron antineutrinos through beta decays. So you get pure electron antineutrinos out. And it turns out that if you know how many decays you have in a reactor, if you know your fission products, you can calculate how many neutrinos are expected to come out. So what I'm showing here is a spectrum of neutrinos emitted from the dominant isotopes in a nuclear reactor: uranium-238, plutonium-239, plutonium-241, and uranium-235. It turns out that more than 99.9% of all electron antineutrinos are produced by fissions by these four isotopes. So knowing the isotopic composition of a reactor, we can predict very precisely, actually, what the spectrum and the total number of neutrinos is that we expect. And this is shown on the right-hand side. It shows you the spectrum. We can calculate the cross-section of neutrinos interacting with our detector. And so we can get an expected energy spectrum that we expect to measure in our detectors. I should also mention that reactors, of course, burn up nuclear fuel. And what that means is that the effective isotopic composition of uranium and plutonium changes in a reactor as a function of time. So over the time of a fuel cycle, whether it's weeks or months, we can see this change in the isotopic composition, and we can also detect it with neutrinos. And this has been used most recently to make some precision studies of both reactors and neutrinos. The last thing I wanted to say is that in recent experiments, we have not only relied on the calculations and modeling of a nuclear reactor, we wanted to do measurements of neutrino properties that are independent of that. And so to enable that, we have placed multiple detectors at different distances from a reactor so that we can do relative measurements. We use a detector very close to the reactor to normalize the flux coming out of the reactor, and then a detector a little bit further away to make the oscillation measurements. So that gives us a way to cancel a lot of the systematics and get to the neutrino physics without having to worry about the reactor systematics. And so one of the experiments that we did in the last decade, we started building it some 15 years ago, was the Diabei experiment in China, where we built a large reactor experiment near a nuclear power plant. We looked around the world to see where there are strong nuclear power reactors next to hills or mountains, because we wanted to place our detectors underground again. And we found the Diabei site in China, just near Hong Kong, about 50 kilometers from Hong Kong. It has 6 reactor cores near some mountains, and we built a tunnel inside the mountain to place several neutrino detectors at different distances. And you see on the left-hand side here, this layout of tunnels that extends with a total distance of about 2 kilometers. And we were able to place multiple detectors at different distances inside this tunnel. Here is another slide that shows you both photos of these experimental halls with the neutrino detectors, as well as the schematic of the neutrino detector. These were 20-ton detectors filled again with liquid scintillator. We doped it with gadolinium to get a good neutron cross-section, capture cross-section. Photomultipliers were used to detect the light that was produced in the neutrino interaction. And in total, we had 8 detectors running, 2 in each of the near halls, near the reactors to normalize the flux, and 4 in the far hall to make the oscillation measurement. And what we, and this experiment was done as an international collaboration between 42 institutions, about 200 collaborators, with main contributions from China, Asia, North America, as well as some European contributions. Here are a few pictures of the construction of the experiment, and it gives you a sense of the scale of the neutrino detectors that we built. So it has grown a little bit from the very first neutrino experiment with Reines and Cowan, where it was like a room-sized detector, to something that's much bigger. We have now these underground halls, big swimming pools of water that we use to shield the detectors from gamma rays from the rock and the surroundings. And in these pools, we place neutrino detectors that contain the liquid scintillator and have the photosensors to detect the flashes of light that are produced when neutrinos interacting in the detector. And this is a picture of the far hall where we have 4 neutrino detectors just to get more target mass, more protons, to have a higher chance of catching neutrinos. And here you see some of the detectors sticking partially out of the water. So this was during the water fill of the pool. And with these detectors running, we were able to measure the flux of neutrinos coming out of the different reactors at the Daya nuclear power plant. And what you see here are the different measurements of the rate as a function of time. And this is from 2012 and 2013, and you see some variations there. The big variations are when the reactors were shut down for refueling, and then you see some smaller variations that have to do with how much power was produced in the reactors. And from this data, we can figure out how many neutrinos we have observed. And with our detectors, we can also measure the energy of the neutrinos. That allows us to reconstruct an energy spectrum, which you see on the right-hand side there. And when we take that data and we compare what we see in the near detector halls, which are about a few hundred meters from the reactors, and the far hall, which is about 1.8 kilometers, you see again a deficit. You see this reduction in the flux of neutrinos, and this has to do again with neutrino oscillations. So in this case, we see the oscillation, the so-called 1-3 oscillation of electron antineutrinos into other flavors over a distance of 2 kilometers. And this allows us to measure the neutrino mixing angle sine squared 2 theta 1-3. And this was one of the unknown mixing parameters of the neutrino mixing matrix at that time. And for this, the Daya experiment was awarded the Science Breakthrough Prize in 2012, and in 2015, the Breakthrough Prize in Fundamental Physics. Now, if you plot this again in L/E, the distance over the energy, you get this beautiful plot that really shows clearly the sinusoidal oscillation, sinusoidal neutrino oscillation. And on the left axis here, you see survival probability. So it gives you the probability that a neutrino changes flavor into something else. And it also tells you again clearly that neutrino oscillation is energy and baseline dependent. So if you go further away, there's a higher chance of seeing a neutrino oscillate, or if you give it a different energy, there's also a different chance of oscillation. And since then, we have continued to collect data. We've made precision measurements. We have now a very precise measurement of the reactor spectrum, where we see the distortion due to the oscillation. We can determine the mixing parameters, the mixing angle theta 1-3 and the mass splitting quite precisely. And you see that we are approaching percent level precision in neutrino physics, which is quite remarkable. So the uncertainties that we currently have on these parameters are of the order of a couple of % or so. Now, this was all great, and it showed that neutrinos oscillate. We could measure the oscillation precisely, but it also opened new questions and puzzles. And it turns out what we found is, again, that the total flux of neutrinos coming out of a reactor was different than what we expected based on models and expectations. It was about 6% different. And this figure on the left-hand side here shows you the data over the prediction at 1, of course, being the normalization. And you see that all of the experiments seem to indicate, or most of the experiments, that there are fewer neutrinos coming out of a reactor than expected, even if you account for neutrino oscillations. Moreover, if you look on the right-hand side on the energy spectrum, and you compare the measured energy spectrum to the predicted energy spectrum, there seems to be a bump at around 5 MeV that people couldn't explain. And so understanding the reactor flux and spectrum anomalies has been something that we've recently studied, because again, it could be an indication of new physics, or it could just be that we don't understand the reactor physics well enough to predict this precisely. It turns out these features, the bump and the deficit in the flux, were also observed in other experiments around the world, not just in the Diabet experiment in China. There was an experiment in France called the double show experiment that saw it, and also a Korean experiment, Reno, saw exactly the same thing. And there's now a suspicion that maybe it has to do with the nuclear models, how we calculate the number of neutrinos that come out of the nuclear reactor. But we don't know that yet for sure. So these are two anomalies in the reactor neutrino sector: the flux deficit, this extra deficit, and the bump. And this flux deficit in particular fueled some speculations that maybe there's a fourth neutrino involved. If we have a fourth so-called sterile neutrino, a new type of neutrino, we could have an additional oscillation that again could cause a deficit without requiring us to rethink our reactor physics. And so there were experiments to test this and pursue this. A number of short baseline reactor experiments were done worldwide in recent years. I led one of them. A number of them were in Europe, in Russia, Asia, and we did one in the US at the high flux isotope reactor, and it was called Prospect. This experiment was much smaller. It was going back to a room-sized detector, and we placed this detector very close to a core of a nuclear research reactor. And we wanted to see if there were any neutrino oscillations taking place at very short distances. Short distances here means of the order of a meter or two. And so we built a special detector, this time a segmented liquid scintillator detector. And you see the photos here on the lower left. This was doing the assembly of the detector. And on the upper right, you see a cross section. So this detector had different segments that allowed us to do effective background discrimination and also study the event topology of the neutrino interaction. In this case, we loaded the scintillator with lithium-6, which has a very high cross section and gives us a good event definition. And by being at a research reactor, we measured the neutrino spectrum from just one single isotope, uranium-235. You recall that power reactors have multiple isotopes, but here at the research reactor, you only have one, and this allows you to make a much cleaner and simpler measurement. So this experiment was done at the high flux isotope reactor at Oak Ridge National Lab in Oak Ridge. In the US, it's a small reactor, 85 megawatts, but it has a very compact core. And the advantage was that we could get very close to it. We were essentially just behind the wall of the reactor containment. And it has a highly enriched uranium core, so 99% of the new EBAR flux comes from uranium-235 fission. This was a collaboration of about 70 collaborators, 14 institutions that worked on this and that we led out of Yale. And we built this detector in 2017 here. We fully assembled it, and then we packed it up and we shipped it. And this was small enough that we could literally put it on a truck, drive it down to Oak Ridge to the reactor, fill it with liquid there, and start taking data. And on this slide, you see on the right-hand side how the detector was moved into position on some air pads in the reactor facility. We had all the liquid scintillator in a big tank and then filled it. And then as soon as the detector was filled, we could see some interactions in the detector. And what you see on the right-hand side here is an event display that shows the first muon track going through the detector. So this is a muon that goes diagonally through the detector, and you can see the energy deposition in the different segments or cells of the detector. Now, being at a research reactor means we're not deep underground. We have lots of backgrounds to deal with, and that was one of the challenges of the experiment. When you have muons or other particles entering the detector, you might get some hadronic showers that just light up the detector. This is what it looks like. And if you have a neutrino candidate, an inverse beta decay candidate, it's a little tiny event like this. It's a localized event. And these are the kind of events that we are picking up with a segmented detector as candidates of neutrinos coming out of the reactor. So one of the challenges, as I mentioned, was backgrounds for this detector, and that informed the design. We used lithium-loaded scintillator for the high neutron capture cross-section. It gave us a good definition of the event. We had an optically separated array of segments, so we could do a lot of different segments in the detector. We could fiducialize it. And then on the lower right, I show you a plot that shows you the several orders of magnitude that we had to reduce our backgrounds to pull out the neutrino signal. So the black line is what you see in the detector as an energy deposition, energy spectrum before any cuts. And then we place some cuts on our data to reduce backgrounds, showers, muons, other backgrounds. We fiducialize it. That means we only use the inner part of the detector, and then we can pull out the neutrino spectrum under all these backgrounds. And what we get out of that is what's shown here. So in blue, you see the spectrum that we see from the reactor before any cuts, before background subtraction. And then the red spectrum is what we measure when the reactor is off. So that gives us a good measurement of the background spectrum just in the detector. And then we subtract those. And then the black dots are the neutrino spectrum, the inverse beta decay candidates that we get out. And again, you see the smooth spectrum that we get out. And from that, we can then do an analysis of neutrino oscillations. And we can also look for if there's any indication of new types of neutrinos, so-called sterile neutrinos. So we did this. We made the first modern measurement of U-235 with anti-neutrinos at a research reactor. You see that on the left. It's a very smooth spectrum. We still see a little bit of a bump at 5 MeV, which seems to indicate that it's perhaps not new physics, but it comes from the reactor models. And then we're also looking for possible oscillations into sterile neutrinos, and we can place an exclusion limit on that. I'm not going to go into the technical details here, but the bottom line is we have not found any new neutrinos. The model of 3 neutrinos still holds, and most likely we have to improve our reactor modeling to get the neutrino prediction from reactors completely right. I wanted to give you, in the last few minutes, just an outlook on where this research field might be heading. I told you that there were a number of experiments around the world, and they're continuing. People have now put together the data from different reactors around the world, from different experiments around the world, and there are also new experiments that are under construction. One of them is the Juno experiment in China, in the Taishan nuclear power plant. It's one of the biggest and most ambitious reactor experiments ever built. So we have dealt in our experiments with detectors the size of 20-ton or kiloton in Camelot. Juno plans to build a 20-kiloton liquid scintillator detector. That's a big sphere. It's a very big detector. It's going to be underground. And if it's successful, it's likely going to be the most precise reactor experiment ever done. The other avenue that we have pursued recently is the application of our physics technology. We can now detect neutrinos from reactors. We can tell you which isotopes are involved. We can do background reduction, which means we can build small detectors. And we're developing concepts for putting detectors on a truck that you can drive up to a nuclear reactor and park outside or maybe move inside. And that allows you to do neutrino-based nuclear monitoring. So that's particularly interesting in certain areas where perhaps you can't do normal reactor monitoring because you can't get access to the reactor facility. So one idea is things like North Korea, South Korea. And neutrinos escape the reactors, and so you can't hide what's happening inside a reactor if you study neutrinos. And so we're developing some concepts on that as well. So let me just come to the end of this overview of the physics that we have done or that has happened in the last 60, 70 years with reactor neutrinos. For over 60 years, reactor experiments have played a key role in neutrino physics. Reactors were essential in discovering the first neutrino, and we're now using them to make precision measurements. Reactor antineutrinos enable a rich program probing neutrino properties. We can measure oscillations. We can search for new types of neutrinos, and they have enabled and stimulated a variety of detector developments. And nowadays, we're even thinking about nuclear monitoring with neutrinos. The baseline from a reactor is very important. At 1 to 2 kilometers, we can measure oscillations very precisely and get a good measure of the antineutrino spectra. At very short baselines, we can test the fuel evolution. We can probe the nuclear models in a reactor and measure their spectra. And this is what we have done at research reactors. And at the longer baseline, and this is now what the Juno experiment is trying to pursue, you can make precision measurements of other oscillation parameters and also try to study the mass hierarchy. Again, that's the arrangement of the mass states for the 3 neutrinos. This is important for model building and for understanding the phenomenology of neutrinos. And I just wanted to conclude by saying that this has been a truly international effort. I've been very fortunate to be able to work in a number of countries with wonderful colleagues, and international collaborations have been key for the recent discoveries, and they've opened the door for new physics. And with that, I will conclude here and thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Professor Heeger, for your lecture. We will now move on to our question and answer session. To our Zoom audience, we remind you that you can send your questions to Professor Heeger by sending a direct message to the person named in Plexis Q&A. For our audience in person at the Congress Center, you will be informed when you can ask your questions directly to Professor Heeger. Miguel. Sorry for the inconvenience where we have lost the microphone.
Thank you, Dr. Karsten, for the talk. It was very interesting. My question is about, I guess it's not been answered yet. It's about neutrinos, of course. So you said the neutrinos has essentially the same speed as speed of light. So, but they have a rest mass different than 0. So in theory, they should be able to move at any, different speeds. For example, just a fraction of the speed of light, So, for example, for neutrinos in cosmology that arrive to us from far distant places, for example, in supernovas, have we able to detect those velocities, or will we be able someday in the future, or it still be a mystery?
Yes, you're asking some very good questions. So I think there were several aspects in your question that I wanted to comment on. You're absolutely right that, of course, strictly speaking, neutrinos are not at the speed of light, a little bit less. They have a tiny rest mass. We don't know yet the absolute mass of neutrinos. We know the mass splitting, which is of the order of 10 to the minus 5 electron volts. We know that based on that, one of the neutrinos must have a rest mass of about 40 milli-electron volts. With that, for cosmological purposes, neutrinos are essentially free streaming, close to the speed of light through the universe, and very effective and very efficient energy carriers. Now, in phenomena like supernova, very interesting things happen, because you have neutrinos that can escape very dense areas of matter even before the light escapes, because basically you don't have the scattering. You have neutrinos that are just weakly interacting. So basically you can see the neutrino signature from exploding stars before you even get the light signature. And it is true that people also have used the fact that neutrinos have mass and the time difference to actually place constraints on the neutrino mass. So that can be done. But one of the things to be aware of is, of course, in supernova environments, you are under very extreme environments. You can have neutrino self-interactions because it's so dense initially, but then eventually they decouple much earlier than the light.
Thank you very much for your answer, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Hello, Professor. I wanted to ask, if we find another neutrino, another flavor, does that mean that would mean that we have another particle like the electron muon, as we have these pairs in the lepton family? Or if we find another, then the lepton's rules would not apply anymore?
This is a very good question. Let me just go back to this one slide that I showed at the beginning. From the measurement of the Z boson width, we know that there can only be 3 active flavors of neutrinos: electron, muons, and taus. When I talk about another neutrino, we call it a sterile neutrino. It would be a type of neutrino that is not associated with a lepton flavor, but that's only accessible through oscillations. So in the normal model, we have 3 neutrinos, nu e, nu mu, nu tau. They can oscillate into each other, and they're always associated with the lepton families. You can now imagine adding a 4th neutrino, or even several more neutrinos that are not associated with the lepton families, but the neutrinos can oscillate into each other, but they don't have any associated leptons. So that is what the idea was for this new neutrino, and it would definitely break the standard model. It would clearly mean that we have to think about new ways of accommodating it. And another way of saying it is that there then has to be a new form of matter, which is not accounted for in our normal standard model suite of particles. And let me just perhaps go to this slide here. On the upper right, you see the figure where I, in this diagram, indicate how the three active flavors can oscillate into each other. And then the fourth sterile neutrino would be a separate entity. So it would only be accessible through oscillations, but it would be a new form of matter.
Thank you very much.
Is there another question? I believe that was all the questions from our audience, Professor Heeger. Once again, thank you for your participation at the International Symposium on Physics. We would also like to take the opportunity to thank our sponsors without whom this event would not be possible: Ternium, Climate AI, and HV. Thank you very much, Professor Heeger.
Well, thank you for having me. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you very much for your presence, and we will see you in a few moments for the closing ceremony of this symposium.